Green Edge, The States and Climate Action by Jeff Cranston, Warrandyte In recent months, Warrandyte as part of the Menzies for Climate Alliance, has focused on the federal election, advocating for voters in the Menzies electorate to choose candidates with strong climate credentials. The election outcome will determine the federal government's future direction in terms of climate action, but this is only part of a much bigger picture. We should not forget the major role of government at the state level in reducing emissions, transitioning to renewable energy, and adapting to climate change. Nor should we forget the important role of local councils in addressing these challenges. We have written about the Manningham Council's Climate Emergency Response Plan and its implementation in previous articles, but we would be remiss not to report on climate action by the states and territories. The states, along with the Northern Territory and the ACT, have vast responsibilities and powers covering so many areas of government, such as education, healthcare, housing, transport, water supply, environmental protection, planning, local government, courts and law enforcement, and so on. Yet they are at a huge fiscal disadvantage compared to the Commonwealth, owing to the federal government's greater capacity to raise revenue, especially by way of income tax. At the time of writing, Australia's emissions reduction targets are 43% by 2030 and net zero by 2050, while later this year, its 2035 target is due to be set in accordance with the Paris Agreement. We may well ask how the states and territories factor into achieving these or any other national targets. In December 2024, the Climate Works Centre published a report entitled Leading Climate Policies from Australia's States and Territories, which examined the significant role of Australia's subnational state and territory governments in the global energy transition. The report's authors found as follows. As of late 2024, every Australian state and territory government has set targets to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 or sooner, with most outlining bold interim goals to accelerate progress. Combined, these state and territory targets add up to an estimated 40 to 44% reduction in Australia's emissions from 2005 levels by 2030, putting the current legislated 2030 national emissions target of 43% within reach, provided state and territory governments deliver on their targets. Looking ahead, state and territory climate targets amount to an estimated 66 to 71% reduction in Australia's emissions from 2005 levels by 2035. Revealing 71% can act as a floor for Australia's upcoming 2035 target. Taking our own state as an example, Victoria was one of the first jurisdictions in the world to legislate a net zero emissions target. Originally net zero by 2050 under the Climate Change Act 2017, but amended last year to net zero by 2045. The Act, now renamed the Climate Action Act 2017, provides for interim targets to reduce emissions by 2025, 28 to 33%, 2030, 45 to 50%, and 2035, 75 to 80%. It also requires a 2040 target to be set by March 2028. To achieve its targets, the Victorian Government is taking extensive measures across a range of areas, including electricity generation. For example, legislated targets for Victoria's electricity to be generated from 65% renewables by 2030 and 95% by 2035. Fuel consumption. For example, reducing Victoria's dependence on fossil gas through reforms under the Victorian Gas Substitution Roadmap. Transport. For example, aiming for 50% of new light vehicle sales to be zero emissions by 2030 and all new public buses to be zero emissions from 2025. In view of the Climate Works report, it seems Victoria and other state-level governments will need to do more of the heavy lifting to enable Australia to achieve its emissions reduction targets, although the future of such targets at the national level is subject to whoever is in power. Following on from its climate change strategy for 2021 to 2025, the Victorian Government is developing its next strategy for 2026 to 30, having recently sought public submissions for this purpose. Warrandyte Can looks forward to evaluating Victoria's 2026 to 2030 strategy once it is published. Jeff Cranston is a member of Warrandyte Can, a local group agitating for positive climate change actions. Find them on Facebook.